Hello and welcome to another video from the only channel you need to not only survive the current apocalypse but actually enjoy it. And today's video is going to be about the story of Lazarus and the rich man. I recently posted a video about the afterlife, and in that video I spoke about quite a few scriptures that I felt were relevant to the subject of what happens to a person after they die. But there was one Bible account that I completely left out. I didn't leave it out because I forgot about it or even because I didn't think that it was important. I left it out because, unlike the scriptures that I referenced in the video, these verses were in the form of what is called a parable. At quite a few scriptures, such as the one found at Matthew chapter 13 and verse 34, we're told that Jesus would not speak to the crowds unless he spoke to them in a parable. Jesus himself explained why he did this at verses like Mark chapter 4 and verse 11, where he said, "To you has been given the secret of the kingdom of God, but for those outside, everything is in parables." As spiritual men, the apostles often understood what Jesus was talking about when he spoke in parables, but sometimes that was not the case. At Mark chapter 4 and verse 1, Jesus taught what has come to be known as the parable of the sower. Later at Mark chapter 4 and verses 13 through 20, realizing that his apostles didn't understand, he took them aside and explained it to them privately. I would have no problem publicly explaining every detail of the parable of the sower to anyone wanting to listen. And if they wished to dispute what I was saying, I would simply open the Bible to the explanation that Jesus gave to his apostles, because my explanation would be exactly the same as Jesus' explanation. The parable of the sower is about how different people react to learning the truth. Had the Bible not recorded Jesus' explanation to his apostles, it would be quite easy to come to the conclusion that Jesus was explaining the proper way for Christians to grow grain. And if we look at the parable itself, everything that Jesus said about growing grain sounds quite reasonable. If I was to come along and tell you that the parable is about how different people react to learning the truth, and someone was to ask me to prove it from the Bible without Jesus' explanation, I really don't know that I could. But honestly, this particular parable was somewhat more cryptic than most. The apostles were usually pretty good at figuring out what Jesus was talking about. The fact that they were confused by some of Jesus' teachings is a good indication that it's okay to be confused about those teachings ourselves. The end result was that after explaining this parable to his apostles, they accepted the explanation. What separated those who loved truth back then was not their incredible mystery-solving skills, but their willingness to accept truth when they heard it, and that is true today as well. The word that is sometimes rendered as parable is often rendered in other ways. Sometimes this word is rendered as illustration or metaphor. According to the Strong's online version of the Concordance, a parable is a comparing of one thing with another, an aphorism, a maxim, a proverb, or a narrative that is fictitious but agreeable to the laws of human life. Defining a parable as agreeable to the laws of human life may be a little misleading. Jesus spoke quite a few parables that, although being understandable according to the laws of human life, they would still be recognized as describing events that in the real world would have been impossible. One parable or metaphor that people are familiar with is recorded at Matthew chapter 7 and verse 5, where Jesus said, "You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye." Most people understand what a log is, what an eye is, and what a speck is. These items and their relationship would be understandable according to the laws of human life, but most people would instantly recognize that Jesus' illustration was obviously not based on an actual incident where someone attempted to remove a speck from another person's eyes while actually suffering from having a log in their own eye. If we look at the story of Lazarus and the rich man carefully, it is possible that we can get some insight into conditions that exist in the afterlife, but have to remember that, like most of Jesus' parables, it is very likely that, as illustrated, the people, places, and events in this metaphor would be describing something that has been exaggerated to such a degree as to be physically impossible. At Luke chapter 16, beginning at verse 19, we read, There was a rich man who was clothed in purple and fine linen, and who feasted sumptuously every day. And at his gate was laid a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who desired to be fed with what fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, even the dogs came and licked his sores. The poor man died, and was carried by the angels to Abraham's side. The rich man also died, and was buried, and in Hades, being in torment, he lifted up his eyes and saw Abraham far off, and Lazarus at his side. And he called out, Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus to dip the end of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in anguish in this flame. But Abraham said, Child, remember that you in your lifetime received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner bad things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in anguish. And besides all this, between us and you a great chasm has been fixed, in order that those who would pass from here to you may not be able, and none may cross from there to us. And he said, Then I beg you, Father, to send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, so that he may warn them, lest they also come into this place of torment. But Abraham said, They have Moses and the prophets. Let them hear them. And he said, No, Father Abraham, but if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent. He said to him, If they do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced if someone should rise from the dead. Jesus always used parables to teach things to people that were willing to think deeply about his words. I feel that I am such a person. But I can only tell you what I believe is being taught here. The Bible does not record anything about Jesus taking his apostles aside to explain this particular parable. As a result, I do not have the luxury of showing you a 1-paragraph explanation from the Bible of what I am about to tell you. People that are willing to listen to the truth will do so. People unwilling to listen to the truth will never do so. Just as Abraham says in this parable, if they do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced, even if someone should rise from the dead. With any of Jesus' parables, the first thing that we have to take into consideration is the surrounding circumstances. Is Jesus responding directly to a particular question? Is he directing his parable at a particular person or audience? Is he addressing some particular event or situation that was transpiring as he was speaking? In the previous verses, the Bible says, the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, heard all these things, and they ridiculed him. And he said to them, You are those who justify yourselves before men, but God knows your hearts. For what is exalted among men is an abomination in the sight of God. These verses set the stage for what Jesus is about to say. To those of us reading this account in the 21st century in an English translation of the Bible, what he says next may seem totally unrelated, but that is not at all the case. The law and the prophets were until John. Since then the good news of the kingdom is preached, and everyone forces his way into it. But it is easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one dot of law to become void. Everyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, and he who marries a woman divorced from her husband commits adultery. What these verses are conveying would have been extremely obvious to those Jewish leaders who would have been well versed in the law. Jesus is reminding them that if they wish to continue trying to please the Creator through the Jewish law, then they cannot pick and choose which laws they wish to be obedient to and which laws they wish to ignore. No one should take these scriptures to mean that Jesus is in any way advocating the continued application of the Jewish law code. If anything, these verses were designed to do exactly the opposite. In his remarks to the Pharisees, he makes a direct reference to the Jewish law of divorce as found in the first 4 verses of Deuteronomy chapter 24, which states that once divorced and remarried, a person would never be allowed to return to their original spouse. In the entire Bible, this precept was only applied one time when Yahweh divorced the nation of Israel, as is recorded at verses like Hosea chapter 2 and verse 2 and Isaiah chapter 50 and verse 1. As representatives of that nation's religious system, the Pharisees were viewed by the Jews as the epitome of righteousness and religious perfection. However, as Jesus is pointing out, they, according to their own law, or nothing more than the rulers of just another dead religion that God had divorced centuries earlier, and according to that same law could never remarry. And just to highlight this very direct reference, Jesus goes on to teach the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. The rich man in this account represents not necessarily the nation of Israel or even the religious law code of that nation, but civilization in general. There are other similar stories in the Bible to confirm this, and if you watch enough of my videos, it won't take long for you to see the repeating pattern. Lazarus means God has helped. His condition is comparable to Job's, whose name means the hated one. There is no denying the similarities in the stories, and Job very obviously in that account represents humanity, or in a broader sense, the earth and creation itself. In a moment, I'll explain the reason for some of the differences in the two accounts. The death of the two represents the establishment of God's kingdom. Just as is promised, Abraham is there, and right there with him is Lazarus. But the rich man is not, because an impenetrable barrier has been placed between them. A very strong reference is made to religious people at verse 16, where they are spoken of as those who try to force themselves into that kingdom. Unlike the religious leaders that Jesus is addressing, Lazarus does not attempt to force himself into God's kingdom by adhering to some kind of system of rules and rituals. He simply waited patiently for the good things that had been given to mankind by God at the gate that had been placed before him by the rich man. The verses that are associated with this story are the kind that are extremely exaggerated to the point of being impossible. But just as I said before, they are based on things that are understandable according to the basic laws of human life. Jesus' audience would have easily understood who Abraham was. They also would have understood the difference between poverty and opulence. They would have understood what the realm of the dead was. They would also have understood what fire was. But it should be obvious, even to us, that they would have recognized this particular story to be a fictional account. There was nothing anywhere in the scriptures that were available to the Pharisees at the time to support that such a scenario was possible. If we're to believe that this account is based on actual events, then we have to believe that at least some of the people that are in hell are on fire. But we also have to believe that those people were under the impression that a single drop of water on their tongue is all that would be necessary to cure the pain of being on fire. We also have to believe that everyone that goes to wherever Abraham is gets to sit next to him and watch people being burned alive. We can also assume that the primary determining factor in who gets to burn and who gets to sit there and watch is for the most part based on a person's financial status. I don't actually believe that these verses in any way accurately represent any aspect of what a human can expect to experience in the afterlife, with one possible exception. If, as I explained in my previous video about the afterlife, everyone in the realm of the dead is alive, retains all of their memories, is able to experience emotions, and is in a dreamlike state that allows them to communicate with God, communicate with angels, and see and understand the past, present, and future, it is possible that a person could be emotionally affected in a negative way. That may seem like a rather mild punishment for a slave trader or someone that has participated in a genocide. But if you think about what I'm saying, the next time that you are sad, you may change your opinion. But it's also possible that these would not experience any negative emotions at all, or at least not for an extended period. Having access to knowledge about the future, they would understand that every bad thing that they had ever done would soon be fixed, and that they were about to get a fresh start. In the book of Job, there is no rich man, but instead there are what the Bible calls Job's three companions. These men represent the three foundation stones of civilization that I often talk about: the governmental system, the economic system, and the religious system. In the story of Lazarus and the rich man, Jesus is not highlighting the Trinitarian system that civilization has in place to control and oppress humanity, but instead is highlighting the length of time that civilization would be allowed to exert that oppression. Instead of being tormented by three men, as Job was, Lazarus is oppressed by the rich man and his 5 brothers. That makes for a total of 6, and if you add Lazarus, a grand total of 7 total characters: Lazarus and those 6 rich men. At 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 8, we are told, "Do not overlook this one fact, beloved, that with the Lord, one day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as one day." Civilization will only be able to oppress mankind for 6 millenniums. What to God would be 6 days. The 7th day, according to God's way of viewing time, would be what the Bible calls a Sabbath, or a rest day. This 1,000-year period is referred to in the Bible as the 1,000-year reign of Christ. That period of time represented by Lazarus himself, who, as the parable clearly describes, is experiencing his time of comfort. The fact that there is a barrier between Lazarus and the rich man would represent the barrier between civilization's rulership over man in that 1,000-year period. This barrier is spoken of in verses such as Revelation chapter 20 and verses 2 through 7, where we are told that Satan would one day be bound and not released for 1,000 years. As King of God's kingdom during that 1,000-year period, Jesus is called our eternal Father. This is brought out at Isaiah chapter 9 and verse 6. The only other character in this account is Abraham, who is repeatedly referred to as Father Abraham. At Genesis chapter 17 and verse 5, God tells Abraham, "No longer will you be called Abram, your name will be Abraham, for I have made you a father of many nations." Father Abraham's presence in this parable is a reference to Jesus, our eternal Father. In recognition of Abraham's authority over Lazarus, the rich man did not directly ask Lazarus to bring him a drop of water, but instead asked Abraham to send Lazarus. This acknowledgement of Abraham's authority over Lazarus is a direct reference to Jesus' authority over God's soon-to-come kingdom. I produced a video a while back entitled "Written in Stone, Gold on the Plains of Dura." That includes a very in-depth understanding of the relationship between the 6 work days and the 7-day week, and the number 666. If the information in this video that you're listening to now intrigues you, then probably you would enjoy watching that video as well, and in fact the entire Written in Stone series. If someone is actually able to convince themselves that they can force their way into God's kingdom by way of some religion, then in all likelihood they're not going to be willing to listen to the truth. They wouldn't listen to the truth from Moses. They wouldn't listen to the truth from the prophets, and they wouldn't even listen to the truth if it came from someone who was resurrected from the dead. However, if someone is willing to listen to the truth, then they don't care what the source is. Even if the truth comes from an internet video produced by an old man sitting in a tent out in the middle of the swamp, they'll willingly listen to the truth. If you're only going to remember one thing from this entire video, remember what Jesus said right before he began to speak the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. What is exalted among men is an abomination in the sight of God. If you don't want to survive, don't listen to me.